Genesis. You can turn with me to Genesis chapter 22. We are in the midst of a series working through Genesis. This week we're going to wrap up the life of Abraham with what's often considered to be the climax of Abraham's life. This is one of the most famous incidents of his life, this story. This story is, I would say, the most famous, the most widely recognized story in the Old Testament. I'm going to go out on a limb and just say that right there. Honestly, even outside the Bible, this story is just widely considered to be a famous, well-known story in all of ancient literature. And it's not just well-known. It is, let's be honest, it is infuriating, it is shocking, it's debated. Like, people have spent their entire lives just debating various meanings of levels in this text. So here we are this morning. We're going to just answer all those questions and figure it all out, okay? I'm obviously kidding. We will leave here with unanswered questions, but we'll work through this. So before we get too far, let's read through this passage. Genesis chapter 22, we'll start in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he rose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and he took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So can you see why this text is debated? Like, this is an intense part in the narrative. People get so bent out of shape about this, all the little details, but I think in doing so, they miss the point. They miss the heart of what this text is really getting at. So I don't want us to make the same mistake this morning, right? I want us to look at this passage, and I want us to focus on three things, we'll call them features of this narrative. We'll look at the essence of the call. We'll look at the call, the horror of the test, and we'll look at the wonder of the lamb. Okay, so we'll look at the call, the test, and the lamb. That's what we'll work through as we work through this passage. So let's start with the call. Easy as that. Let's jump in. Let's start with the call. What is the call? Like, what is the call here in this passage? Well, for that, you need to look at verse 2. Okay, God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So, did you notice the resemblance to the other call that God had given Abraham? This is one we looked at weeks ago, Genesis chapter 12. Similarities are shocking, honestly. Then and now, Abraham is told to go. Like, leave the familiar, remember, leave the comfortable, leave your stable situation, Abraham, and go. Both then and now, go. And go where? Well, that's the other thing we see in both of these calls. Genesis 12, Genesis 22. He's called both then and now to go to a place that he would be shown later. That's what it says here, right? God's like, I want you to go to the region of Moriah, this land of Moriah, one of those mountains over there. I'm going to fill you in on the details and the specifics later on. Just go, right? So he's not only called to go, he's called to launch out and go without knowing where he's going to end up. Like, he doesn't know how the story's going to end up. Just go. I'll tell you later. And then finally, he's not just called to go, and he's not just called to go to a place that he'd be told later, but he's also called, and this is important, to offer up something. We saw that in the first call, Genesis chapter 12, and he was called to offer up quite a bit back then, right? Leave your civilization, leave safety behind that civilization offers, leave your status, leave your culture, leave your family, leave everything behind, drop it, offer it up to me, right? And now, of course, what's he called to offer up? His son, Isaac. God says, what does he say? Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And God's not just rubbing it in, right? Take your son, whom you love, offering up. No, like, take your son, your only son, Isaac. Of course, we know Isaac wasn't literally Abraham's only son because, remember, Ishmael, his older son, but Ishmael's gone now. That's another story for another time. Now it's just Isaac. We just see Isaac. In a sense, Isaac is the only bearer of the family name, of the family inheritance, right? In a sense, Isaac is the only hope Abraham has of seeing that promise of God come to life, come to fruition. And not only that, God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac. What does he say? Whom you love. It is no surprise that Isaac had become Abraham's emotional center. Like, he was everything to Abraham. So God isn't just asking him to offer up his son. He's asking Abraham to offer up the only source of security and significance and promise of any sort of future. Whom you love, offer him up. Now, we'll get to this particular call in just a second, but I think, and this is especially true as we sort of wrap up Abraham's narrative in this book of Genesis, I want to just step back and ask the question, what have we learned about the call? You know, what does it mean, this call language, right? What's the essence of the call? What's the call, all right? And the reason we need to ask that question is because, well, throughout the New Testament, specifically Romans chapter 8, we're told that God justifies those whom he calls. That's Romans 8, 28 through 30, if you want to go home and read that later. And not only that, but then we're told in Ephesians chapter 1, we're told that this is the way he matures us more and more as followers of Jesus. It's by coming to know more deeply the riches and the hope of our calling. So Paul, in the New Testament, he has got a lot to say about this call of God. And I think the Bible's pretty clear. You are not a follower of Jesus unless you've heard God's call. Let me say that again. You're not a follower of Jesus unless you've heard the call of God. And it's not just that the call of God comes once and then we're done. You know, pick up the phone, God calling, you know, that's it. No, the call keeps coming. So it's not only how you become a follower of Jesus, but it's also how you grow, how you mature more and more into the image of the Son. So what is the call? That's the question. What's the call? Here is what the writer of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 and 9. Verses 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place that he was to receive as an inheritance. He went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promises, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Verse 10, for he was looking forward, pay attention, to the city that has what? Foundations, whose designer and builder was God. So you start to sense the call of God when you realize that without God, there are no foundations. Let's be honest. Think about this. The world has no foundations to offer us. There's a lot of things that the world offers that claim to be good foundations, but then we try them and they don't last. They constantly fail us. They never last. And when you realize that, and only when you realize that, you begin to hear the call. I'll use this as an example to try and explain this, okay? There are a lot of people out there who think the Christian faith and the claims of the Bible are just ridiculous nonsense. They'll point to science, they'll point to education, academia, like things that they think are very solid and established and will never fade, right? And they'll point to those things and they'll jump to the understanding that the Christian faith is just ridiculous. It's nonsense. Meanwhile, okay, those same people will read position papers or opinion pieces. They'll read academic articles from educated people in the past, say 25 years ago, 50 years ago, right? And they'll read those and they'll laugh. They'll be like, oh, how embarrassing. Like, how in the world would you even say that? We can't accept that as true. Oh, how far we've come. Like, how great our understanding is now. All the things intelligent academics know are true and right and obvious today will be laughed at in just 25, 50 years. You'll see. So why in the world do you think that we're any different? Like, why has time stopped all of a sudden? No. Here's the thing, okay? Intellect is not a good foundation, right? There are no foundations. So every objection to God's truth, it's passing away. Like, there are no, and we seek intellect as a foundation, and we seek whatever it is we seek, it's not going to last if it's not built on the foundation of God, okay? Every single one of us, I don't care who you are, I don't care if you're a religious person or not, we all have something or some things that we point to which are important to us, right? And we're like, oh, this is important to my self-image and my hope and my security. It's an object of your soul's faith, right? You might say to me, Scott, no. I'm not a religious person. I don't do that. To which I would say to you, there is no such thing as a person that is not religious, because every single one of us, think about this, has something in your life that if you didn't have it, you would be nothing, empty, meaningless, right? And that right there is the object of your soul's faith. That is the thing that you worship. And when you begin to realize this, whatever it is, okay, whatever it is that you cling to, and it's just fleeting, it's passing away, like life will strip you of it eventually. That's what life does. And when you begin to realize this, you begin to hear the call. It doesn't matter if you're nice. It doesn't matter if you go to church. It doesn't matter if you claim to be religious. It doesn't matter if you believe all the right things and check all the right boxes. None of that matters if you haven't heard the call. Abraham went out. He heard the call. not knowing where he was going, not knowing how this was going to end up, but he did so, and he left seeking the city that was built on foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So the call is what makes us followers of Jesus, and I would also claim that it's the call that grows us as we mature as followers of Jesus. So if you've been following Jesus for some time, maybe you've come to realize this. Maybe you haven't. I don't know. Hopefully I'll open your eyes to this. Sometime after you made the decision to follow Jesus, you made the claim that God was your only foundation, right? God is my foundation. But over time, you've come to realize that functionally, practically, your heart hasn't really changed too much. You might say, Scott, God is my foundation, but there's also all this stuff. Human approval, status, wealth, power, all of which practically act as your real foundation in life. And if that's you, living your life on a foundation that doesn't last, you're never going to be able to live a life of justice and courage and self-control, because you're always going to be devastated by failure and approval, and you're always going to be living in fear because, well, you're going to lose that thing that you just want to hold on to for dear life. In other words, even if you have a good life, there will come a point, I'm sorry, I love you, got to say this, there will come a point when life is going to come and take away everything. But every time that happens, every time difficulty comes your way, what is that? Well, that's God saying, listen to the call. You think your heart says you need to have this thing in order to make you happy? You think your heart says you need to have this thing in order to be important or a person of value? No. All you need is me. I'm what makes you important. I'm what makes you valuable. I'm what makes your life have meaning. All you need is me. And that's how the call grows us, because every time you hear that, you answer that call, and your heart shifts in the right direction. Functionally, you begin to rest in and trust and truly offer up the thing that you're trying so desperately to cling to, right? And you don't just say, no, you can't have that, God. No. Listen, it's going to be ripped from you regardless, so you might as well offer it up. You're sitting there going, Scott, man, I don't want to hear that. Too bad. Okay, that's the truth. Why not look at your accomplishments or your friends or your appearances or your wallet or your status or whatever it is and say, well, it's not going to last anyway, so I might as well, why not offer it up? Why not say, well, my heart says I need this, but what I really need, God, is more of you. So why not offer it up? And as we do, that's the call. That's how we grow and mature as followers of Jesus. Now, before I move on, because I told you 3 points today, I want to get a little practical, okay? Because I hear this all the time. People ask me, if I make that decision to follow Jesus, if I check that box today, will I have to do this, or will I have to do that? Or, can my life look like this? Can I still do this? Can I still do that? Here's another way to put it. Scott, I am not going to just give up my life and be willing to choose to trust in and follow after him unless I know exactly what that life is going to look like. I want to know. Write it down, okay? Contractual agreement here. I want to know every little detail. But what's the problem with that? This is the problem with that, okay? Over and over again in the scriptures, God says, what? Go to the place that I'm going to show you later. I'm not going to tell you every little detail, right? What I want is just commitment. I want you to follow me no matter what I tell you. So if a person says, I'd be happy to follow God as long as he doesn't tell me I have to do this, or as long as he doesn't tell me I have to give this part of my life. Look, listen, let me define who you worship as God, all right? That God, your God, okay, is that thing in your life that you are not willing to give up. That the non-negotiable thing in your life, that's your God. So if you say, I'll follow Jesus as long as he doesn't say this, or as long as he doesn't make me give up this part of my life, like if you say that, then Jesus is not the God that you serve and worship. He's not the one you're following, right? It's the thing that you're not willing to let go of. That's your God. If you do that, what you're saying is that thing that I am clinging so desperately to, the thing that I'm not willing to give up, that's the God that I serve. And Jesus, I'll follow you. I'll trust you as long as you don't make me give up this true God of my heart. Like I'll pray, I'll deal with you, Jesus, as long as you allow me to keep the real God of my heart front and center. But listen, unless you're willing to say to the God of Abraham, I will go, not knowing where I'm going to land. Like whatever it is that I discern as your will, I'll do it, Lord, unconditionally. Unless you're willing to say that, then you're not really going to him at all. You're not answering the call. So this text, okay, this text doesn't just tell us about the call of God in general, because I think there's some distinct things in this call that are a bit unusual. I'll just say it, a bit horrifying here, right? A lot of people read through this narrative and their gut reaction is, I just can't handle this. I can't handle this story. Like, how crazy is it that God would ask someone to do this and for Abraham to just go along with it? Like, it's no big deal to be willing to murder his own son. What is this? Right? And we just read through the story and we say, all right, like, no idea what's going on here, right? But no, we don't really know what's going on here, but here's what you need to know. Like sometimes God just asks us to do crazy stuff that we just can't wrap our minds around. So obey God, obey him perfectly, no matter how crazy the command is. Just go, obey God. But that's not what's going on here, okay? There's more going on here. In order for us to understand what's actually going on here, we need to understand what this call, what this test would have meant for Abraham. A little digging will tell you that God isn't asking Abraham to murder his son. I want to set the record straight, right? I want to be clear. God isn't asking Abraham to murder his son, because if he was, think about it. He didn't say, Abraham, march into that tent and stab him, right? No, that's not what happened. He didn't say that. What did he ask of Abraham? Offer him up as a sacrifice. And it's also important to realize that because God asked him to offer up his firstborn as an offering, this command wouldn't have seemed as crazy to Abraham as it seems to us. So in order to understand how horrifying this is, and it is horrifying, we'll get there, we need to understand the meaning of the firstborn, that little firstborn word. We talked about this a little bit Tuesday nights during the Institute, so you guys should come, join us, right? But we have sort of a difficulty understanding this because, well, we are so individualistic. We're all about my hopes and my dreams and my future and my accomplishments, right? But in this society, everything was different. Nobody thought that way. You didn't think as individuals. Your hopes and your dreams were for who? The family. For the family's success, for the family's prosperity. So in that day, the oldest son, the firstborn, would receive a double portion of the inheritance. And that's how families would maintain their status in their community because a family only had a certain amount of wealth, and if you were going to divide that up 15 ways, it wouldn't go as far, right? But you give the firstborn a double portion to ensure that the family didn't immediately lose their status and their influence in that community. You look to the firstborn. It's the hope of the family, right? But in that society, in that culture, God says, yeah, that life of the firstborn, that's mine. And we see this all throughout the scriptures. Like firstborn cattle, okay, sacrifice to God, always. First fruits of grain are always given to God as an offering. And now in this text, God says, yeah, the life of the firstborn, I want that too. It's very similar to what happens in the Passover, if you're familiar. Maybe you remember the Passover in the Exodus, right? God brings down this judgment on the people of Egypt for their oppression and their wickedness and their violence, and whose life is forfeit as an act of judgment? The firstborn. It's the firstborn, right? And during the Passover, even the Jewish firstborn were at risk. You know, God says, listen to me, Israelites, those firstborn, they're going to die if you don't do something. If judgment comes down, they're going to die unless a lamb is slain. You might be thinking, okay, one time in the scriptures that God says firstborn is mine. Yeah, I don't think it's a recurring theme. I doubt it. Listen, it is. You're wrong. Love you. And I'll prove it to you, okay? Exodus 22. Numbers chapter 8. Numbers chapter 3. I'll read you a couple verses. And as the redemption price for the 273 of the firstborn of the people of Israel, over and above the number of the male Levites, you shall take 5 shekels per head. You shall take them according to the shekel of the sanctuary, the shekel of the 20 gerahs. Redemption price for the firstborn, 5 shekels. What is going on here? Here's what this is, okay? And this is what Abraham understood. There is a debt of sin that every family owes. Ugh. You might not like that, right? It might not make sense to you, but it made sense to Abraham. There is a debt of sin every family owes. Listen, if Abraham had heard that voice of God and God said, Abraham, go into that tent and I want you to just kill Sarah, all right? Just murder her. I think the story would have turned out a whole lot different because he wouldn't have done it, right? And it's important to note that God didn't ask that, okay? So when God says, Abraham, offer up your firstborn, what he's saying to Abraham would have immediately understood because Abraham knew what all the other ancient Hebrews knew. There is a God of justice. There is a God of justice, and all human beings fail to live according to the law of that just God. We all live self-centered lives. We all are in glad rebellion. It's the reason the world is the way that it is today, right? And a God of justice can overlook that. A God of justice cannot overlook that. There is a debt every family and every human being owes to God. And in that family-oriented society, that debt means what? The forfeiture, the offering up, the sacrifice of the firstborn. This is God's way of saying no one is righteous. There is a debt of sin everyone must pay. So when God said, Abraham, offer up your son, Abraham realized what was going on. God is calling in his debt. Pay up. And therefore, I think he realized the horror of the test because think about this. Like, what do you think was going through Abraham's head as he was heading up that mountain? You think he was like, oh, this is easy. I got this. No big deal. Just another day, right? No. He was in pain. He was torn apart. He was confused because on one hand, you have this God of command, right? Justice. There's a debt that has to be paid, but there's also the promise of God, right? That through Isaac, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, would be saved. So here's what Abraham had to be thinking. How can the God of justice, the God of command, also be a God of promise? Like how can God be both just and justifier? How can God be both holy and gracious? How can God rightly call in that debt of sin and simultaneously say that through Isaac, all the nations of the earth will be blessed? How's that going to happen? That's the horror. That is the horror. It's so much more frightening than child sacrifice, by the way. Abraham, are you willing to give up that gift of God's promise? That's the test. And Abraham's trying to figure this out. How can God be both gracious and just? Like gracious and holy. How is that? If God isn't just, then what hope is there in this world? Because in this world there is evil, and that is clear. But if God is just, well, then what hope is there for us? What hope is there for you and me, right? So how can God be both just and justifier? How can he be both the God of command and promise? What's the answer? Which brings me to my final point, and I know I'll wrap this up soon, I promise. Ask any scholar, and they would tell you where the emotional peak is in this narrative, right? It's the place where it seems like the narrator's slowing down for a bit. The action slows down and it focuses in on one little conversation that's happening here. Look how slow this is, okay? Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac, his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Notice what he says, verse 8. Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. What was it that got Abraham up the mountain? Right? Was he saying all the ways, marching up the mountain, I can do this, I can do this, I can do that, I got this, right? I got the obedience for this test, I've got this. No, he was not saying that. That's not what was in Abraham's heart. So what was drawing him up the mountain? What's giving Abraham the ability in this moment to put one foot in front of the other as he's walking up that mountain, right? We see it in the text. God will do it. God will provide the lamb. He's saying, I don't know, son. I don't know, Isaac. I don't know how God's going to be both holy and gracious. I don't know how God will have this debt of sin paid. That's why we're headed up this mountain. But also continue to be the God of promise who says, through Isaac, the world will be blessed. I don't know, son, but he'll do it. God will do it. He will provide the lamb. We can't see it, but he does. He will. And that's what's getting him up this mountain. I can't do this. I can't on my own, but God will. He will provide, not me. And it's also evident in what they choose to name the mountain. They say, okay, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Not, on this mount, I did it. Pass the test. No, on this mount, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. God provided. God will do it. He's not entirely sure how it's going to work, but he says, God will find a way somehow to both pay the price, pay this debt of sin, and also be the God of promise and grace. And of course, we know what Abraham could only guess and dream of. What am I talking about? What do we know? First of all, we know that Abraham's little lamb couldn't pay the price of sin for his family. All right, Isaac couldn't really have paid the price for the sin of his family. Of course, there's a ram caught in the bushes in this passage, but we know the blood of goats and the blood of bulls doesn't atone for sin. So here's a question. Why didn't Abraham have to bring the knife down on his son? How could God be the God of both justice and grace and promise? How can we be the God of holiness and grace? I'll tell you how. Because centuries later, the Father led his beloved Son up this same mountain, and he was offered up as a sacrifice. And when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Father paid the price in his silence. How do you know God loves you? Well, how do you know he delights in you? Like, how do you know so much that you can just rest in that and be freed of people's approval and like, how can you be free of that? How can you just rest? How can you know that he loves you? Well, you've got to see that Abraham and Isaac going up this mountain is just a picture of the price the Father paid in offering up his only Son. It's got to move you. It's got to change you. You've got to realize, like, Father, you didn't withhold your Son, your only Son, for me. And you'll never be like Abraham by trying, right? Just putting one foot in front of the other and trying to get up that mountain because you can do this. You're never going to get there, right? You've got to be moved. You've got to be changed. You have to believe in the one whom Abraham and Isaac points. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this famous yet challenging text. But most importantly, Lord, I thank you for the fact that you gave your only Son for us. To use the language of the text, you ascended that hill, you ascended that mountain with your only Son. You laid him on the wood. Only this time there was nobody there that would stop you, that would do anything. You knew it had to be done. And Lord, we thank you for that. We thank you that you would just do that for us, paying the price. I just ask that you would help us to see this, and that this knowledge would just transform us and change us. Help us to see who you are, Lord. You're a God of holiness and a God of grace. We thank you for this sacrifice. In Jesus' name, amen.